Band of Brothers is a fantastic book about an airborne division in World War II that faces challenges ranging from a leader who is anything but a leader to his men freezing in the middle of a standoff with the far more prepared Nazis as the men sat in their soon-to-be graves if no action took place. The themes represented throughout the story are heroism, leadership, and camaraderie among the battalion of elite soldiers. Major Richard Winters is depicted as the main character in Band of Brothers, as he is their loyal leader who leads the men into combat and strives to teach the men to work together to accomplish a task rather than taking it upon themselves. Winters teaches his men a lesson very similar to the African proverb as stated by the only man to ever run a sub-2-hour marathon, Eliud Kipchoge of Kenya. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Teamwork was a major building block for the men, as once they learned to work together and combine all of their efforts, that is when the best outcome would then reveal itself. Camaraderie among the men was very important as they had begun to understand how to adapt and live with one another. From this experience, they had begun to build an inseparable bond. From this bond, one must ask themselves, what would these men do in a situation where they became separated and stranded from each other, and when their basic training must then kick in? Led by a boss instead of a leader, it was not long before the men developed a disliking towards their leader, Henry Sobel. Sobel led the men by demands and consistent consequences. When the company was finally handed over to Winters, he capitalized on this opportunity to teach the men about how a group effort is stronger and more effective than a single action by an individual. As stated previously, Winters has heavily pushed teamwork and working together to accomplish a task. Sobel had authority over the men. Lieutenant Winters had the respect. His teachings of teamwork, however, rendered useless for the first half of their first deployment on D-Day. After unexpectedly jumping at the very last moment, the men found themselves sporadically dispersed in a very foreign land. This sense of being alone and needing to reconnect with their comrades triggered a fight-or-flight response from the men, as they realized they had to regroup if they had the best chance of surviving. They had hammered into us that the main thing, if you get hit, don't get excited. The worst thing you can do is go nuts. Instead of sitting and waiting for someone to come find them, the men had to take it upon themselves to seek out their brothers in arms in hopes of being able to accomplish their assigned task. Band of Brothers would have been a better book if it had done two things better. These two things are developing characters and their individual personalities, as well as not hopping from one character's perspective to others as much. Understanding the personalities of each character would have made the book better because it would assist the reader in understanding why certain characters acted as they did. The bouncing from individual to individual made the timeline difficult to understand, as the time frame would often switch from present to future, and then somehow relate to the past. Overall, it just made the timeline of events difficult to understand. There were a few moments in the book where curse words or vulgar language was used, but it was almost always used in the context of a character speaking. One other element of the book that could raise a red flag was the violence that took place. It is to be expected in a book about war that violence would make an appearance at some point. Fortunately, there was only 2 to 3 scenes in the whole book where violent acts were explained in depth, but other than that, the violence is more of a setting characteristic that helped the reader understand the scenario that was taking place. Some notable things to mention about Band of Brothers that were good and enhanced the story was the differentiating between the leadership of Winters and the boss role of Sobel, and how they as leaders clashed in leadership styles. Another is the teamwork and how it sets a tone of how these men carried out their assigned tasks. Finally, the sharing of common wealth. The men all related to each other when they would sit in the cold and refuse to eat and drink as long as their brothers had food. This sense of putting others before themselves is what made the battalion such a close-knit group. My favorite quote from the book was, "The soldier's concern is with death, not life. The destruction, not construction. The ultimate destruction is killing another human being." The reason I like this quote was because after experiencing the atrocities of war, these men finally understand how precious life is and how easy it is for global disagreement to result in the loss of way too many people. I agree with both the quotes. The book is unequally divided into descriptions of the men's experiences pre-war, during the war, and post-war, and Winters is painted as the white knight savior of the company prior to their commitment on D-Day, and an example of what a leader should be. Because the book jumps from stating something in relation to the event that is currently taking place in the story to making a statement about how the character's life was before the war. Also, Winters was a man that led the company into battle after a messed up deployment into the Battle of D-Day. He regrouped some of his men and began seeking out others while moving in and attempting to carry out the objective. I disagree with the quotes. Much of the book is spent examining the commanders of E Company, contrasting their leadership styles. Yet he offers no compelling reason to believe that the bonding experience is any different than other non-war activities, as well as, where Gray describes the horror of war, Ambrose chooses to follow SLA Marshall in attempting to glorify war. This reason for me disagreeing is because the book depicts the men in war and how their camaraderie pushed them to not give up in the most difficult of situations, not contrasting Sobel from Winters. Secondly, Ambrose describes how these men were brought together by war and never discussed how this bond was different from a non-war activity. Therefore, this quote adds no value to the review. Lastly, Ambrose never once glorified war. He simply used the chaos of war to set the scene for the characters' actions, and why they carried out the actions they did. I question the statements Ambrose tells a good story. At the same time, Ambrose glosses over some of Winters' shortcomings, and the reader is left with the feeling that he is almost too good to be real. And he is also indicating that the war made them better men than they would have been otherwise, implying that there had been no war to mold them. Their lives would have been taken darker, less brotherly paths. The reason I question these statements is because Ambrose tells a good story is an opinion, therefore it does not belong in the review. Secondly, Ambrose simply described the actions of Winters, and the feeling of him being too good to be real is up to the reader. Lastly, what the war made of them in comparison to what they otherwise would have been cannot be proven because there is no example to be compared to. The statement of their life taking a darker, less brotherly path cannot be supported because once again there is no supporting evidence for this claim. Overall, Band of Brothers is definitely a book that I would recommend to all high school juniors as it teaches how to be an effective leader in comparison to being a boss who demands. The book, in my opinion, would score a 4 out of 5. The reason I cannot give this book a 5 out of 5 is due to the fact that the book lacked character development and the jumping from character to character was sometimes difficult to follow in some situations.